Next, let's look at loops. The most commonly used loop construct is the for statement. Now, the for statement has a similar version in most modern programming languages, but it's a little confusing at the beginning. So let me summarize it now, but show you some examples shortly. So the idea of the for statement is that in parentheses, you have three pieces. First, you have an initialization step. The initialization step is executed before you start looping or start repeating the body of the loop. Often, the initialization step assigns a variable value. Then you have a test. The test is executed or is compared to each time before you execute the loop. So once before you execute anything, you run the initialization. Then each time you go around the loop, each time you repeat, before you do the repetition, you check this test. And then finally, you have some sort of operation that does an update. Typically, the continue test tests if a variable is in a certain range. And the update operation increases or decreases the value of the variable. So set the variable to some initial value, check to see if it's less than or greater than some cutoff, do the loop, and after the loop, do the update. So to recap, before you execute the loop at all, you do the initialization. Each time you loop, before you go, you check this test. If it's true, you continue. If it's false, you stop. And after each loop, you do the update operation. The second most common looping construct is while. While this is true, do all these statements inside. Now, of course, the while won't be very interesting unless either the thing you're testing changes each time. Like if you said while math.random is less than 0.5, well, that test changes each time. The return value of math.random is different each time you call it. It's a random value between 0 and 1. So that would be a legal use of while, because sometimes it would be true, sometimes it would be false, and so you wouldn't exactly know how many times you go around the loop, but you wouldn't loop forever. Even more common is you do a test where the body of the loop changes the test. So you say while x is less than 25. Initially, x is, say, 0, but inside the body, you add some small value to x, so eventually it becomes greater than 25, and the loop stops. Okay, again, I'm just kind of summarizing here. It won't be so clear until we see examples. Before we give the actual examples, let me introduce a new construct, console.log, which is very useful for testing and practice. So the idea is that console.log is kind of like a print statement. JavaScript is one of the few modern languages that doesn't really have a statement that says print something out. The reason for this lack in JavaScript is that JavaScript was originally designed to be executed in a browser. So where do you print something out? Well, there's nothing for the end user to see except in the HTML page. However, as JavaScript has evolved, people have used it in other places, and particularly for interactive testing and practice, it's useful to have a print statement, something that just prints out a value in the Chrome or Firebug console. So console.log is not something you use in a deployed application. It's something you use for practice when you're testing. The simplest way to use console.log is just supply a value. If you say console.log test, and test is a string, then the string test is printed out in the JavaScript console of Firebug or Chrome. If you supply multiple values, it just outputs all of them separated by spaces. So it'll output a 1, and then a 2, and then a 3, and then the string test, all in the same line. The most important or most valuable use of console.log is with placeholders. So you have this funny little placeholder, %o. It's a lowercase o. And if you have 3 placeholders, then you should have 3 values. And the value that comes after the string gets put into that one. The value that comes second after it, the value that comes third after it. So suppose that x is 1 and y is 2. The output will be sum of 1 and 2 is 3. There are some other things besides %o. %o is the most generally useful. %d is used for numbers, and you can get control over the decimal places. And %s is for things you want to output that you don't want to display objects. Later on, we'll also supply objects. And %o will show the actual values inside the objects. So in general, use %o unless you have a specific reason to do otherwise. If you've ever used another language like C#, C++, Python, or Java, this is very similar to the printf command that's available in those languages. So again, to recap, you have a placeholder %o. The first use of %o, the first value after the string, gets inserted in. The next use of %o, the second value after the string gets inserted in. And the third use of %o, the third value after the string gets inserted in at runtime. And you can see a lot more details on what you can use console.log for in the online documentation, but the basic usage is pretty simple. Supply a simple value and it just outputs it. Supply a string that has some %o placeholders and some values to go in for the placeholders, and outputs it as well. Okay, so we will use this idea to test out some of the looping constructs. So let's make a function called count, where I supply a number. And then I will say set I to be 0. So remember, it has 3 parts: the initialization, the loop test, and the update operation. So before you do anything, make a local variable called I and set it equal to 0. Okay, fine. I've set I equal to 0. And then I have the test. This test is checked each time before the loop is executed. Is I less than n? Well, I don't know. What's n? Well, you don't know what n is until at runtime you call the function. But suppose I passed in 5. Well, I set I equal to 0. Is I less than 5? Oh, yes, it is. So I'll execute the loop, and it'll output I is %o. It'll stick the I in here, and it'll say I is 0. All right, that was the first time around the loop. And then before it executes the loop again, it'll do the update operation. I++ is a shorthand way of saying I equals I plus 1. In other words, increment I. Make I be 1 greater than it was before. So assuming that you passed in 5, you set I equal to 0. You checked, is 0 less than 5? Yes, it is. So you did the console.log statement that output this. You added 1 to I. You checked if 1 is now less than 5. Yes, it is. It output the second one. It output the third one. It output the fourth one. It output the fifth one. But then, the 5th time around the loop, it added 1 to I. I is now 5. Then before it executed the loop again, it said, is I, which is 5, less than n, which is 5? No. And so it stops. So if you pass in 5, it runs it 5 times, and I is 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. It sets I to 5, but then the test fails and it never executes the loop with I is equal to 5. Okay, so this is the most common usage of for. The general usage of for is that's any initialization that's done before the loop. This is any test that's done each time before you go around the loop. And this is any update that's done at the end of each loop execution. But the most common usage is set a local variable. Compare if the local variable is less than or greater than some cutoff. Update the local variable in some way. All right, here's an example of using while. So I pass in some cutoff. I start a local variable equal to 2. And then I say, while that local variable is less than the cutoff. Well, this won't be very interesting unless the body of the loop changes either the local variable num or the cutoff. And in this case, it changes the local variable num. So first I output the value of the local variable, and then I double it. And I keep going until it's no longer less than the cutoff. So for example, if I pass in 20 as the cutoff, it'll start at 2, and then it'll double and get 4, it'll double and get 8, it'll double it and get 16, then it'll double and get 32, it'll check, is 32 less than 20? No! And so you'll never get the printout where the number is equal to 32. Okay, there's also a construct called do, which is just like while, except it does the test at the end instead of the beginning. I almost never use it. If I want to do the test at the end, I just kind of reformat my while statement so I get the same effect. And so this is not commonly used, but you should be aware that it exists. You might see it in someone else's code. And then there's the for statement that uses in. Now, many other languages like Java and C# have a similar construct that's quite useful. But the version in JavaScript is much less useful. In particular, it's less useful for arrays. In most other languages, where you have something and you're dealing with an array, we'll see in the next section what arrays are, the values are each of the individual values in the array. But with JavaScript, the values are the indexes, the numeric values of each of the boxes in the array. We'll see what arrays are very shortly, and so this is not very useful. And the reason it's not very useful is, first of all, well, if I have to only get the indexes, I could use the other kind of for loop anyway. And we'll see later that arrays can have other things in them besides numeric indexes. And then that gets messed up. So really, the only use of the for in loop is for objects. Now, we don't know what objects are yet, but here's a quick example. I have a value called person, and it has a first name property, Brendan, and a last name property, Ike. Brendan Ike, by the way, is the original developer of the first version of JavaScript. And when I say for, I make up a variable named property in, and I point at that thing. Then each time around the loop, the value of the property is first name, last name, and if there are any others. Okay, we don't know what objects are. This is not widely used, but just keep in mind that there is a kind of loop that loops down the names of the properties of objects. We haven't covered objects yet, but since we mentioned loops, I'll just mention this one. But neither this nor the do loop are commonly used. The for loop and the while loop are the ones that you should learn and the ones you should practice now, but just be aware that there are two other kinds of loops that exist.